joined by Professor Hanko, Emeritus Professor of the Protestant Reformed Seminary, and we're at Gartmore House in Scotland, north of Glasgow, and we're here to discuss one of Professor Hanko's books, A Pilgrim's Manual, Commentary on 1 Peter. One of the most obvious questions is, why that title, Professor? A Pilgrim's Manual.
The viewpoint of Peter already in the early part of the epistle is that he is writing to God's people in Asia Minor, especially Central Asia Minor, from the viewpoint of the fact that they are pilgrims and strangers in the earth. He calls them that more than once in the epistle. And the whole epistle is dedicated to telling God's people as pilgrims and strangers in the earth how they must live in a wicked world, which is a foreign world to them. And that's the reason I chose that title.
Do you feel this to be a message needed in the 21st century, the way the living of professed Christians is going?
Very much so. In my judgment, there aren't many of God's people who realize what it means to be a pilgrim and stranger in the earth, and much less even how they must live if they do become conscious of that. It was a theme that was well known to God's people in earlier times, even to those outside the church. There are songs, hymns, I think even maybe Negro spirituals, which express that God's people are pilgrims and strangers in the earth. This world is not my home, I'm only passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. I don't know, I think that's a spiritual. But God's people have lost sight of that, at least in countries where most of God's people are very affluent and have many of this earth's possessions.
I suppose John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress,
Right,
he's in connection with Bedford Jail.
right. His life came to mind, and his Pilgrim's Progress came to mind many, many times as I was writing the book. I like that line in, of all places, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, where Huckleberry Finn was asked if he ever read Pilgrim's Progress, and he said he had. Interesting but tough, Huckleberry Finn said in Mark Twain's book. That's true too.
Well, Prof, you're obviously getting a bit older. I imagine the pilgrimage idea means probably more to you now in later life. Is that a fair enough comment?
That is true, yeah. My wife and I were talking about that just the other day, that although we know we're pilgrims and strangers all our life, as we get older, our world gets smaller and smaller. You lose interest in this, and you don't care about this anymore, and you can't do this anymore, and you're limited in your activities by the infirmities of old age, and you don't care a snap whether the Tigers are in first place or in last place, and you don't care if you've got $50 in the bank or $1 million in the bank. What difference does it make? You're soon finished with life anyway. And so your interests close in, and your life gets narrower and narrower. And I think the Lord does that purposely to prepare us for the time that we're leaving this life. This is, as the spiritual has it, this world is not my home. And you feel that and you feel an increased longing too to go home, because the world with all its promises has nothing to offer. Nothing. You can go where you will, you can search where you want. The world has nothing to offer, just trouble and grief and misery and sorrow, that's all.
Well, Prof, you taught Greek, and you have preached many years and still are preaching, and preaching for us too at the British Reformed Fellowship Conference. Is there any connection between this book on First Peter and your preaching activity in the churches?
Well, I preached a series on First Peter. No, I shouldn't say that. I preached a series on First Peter after I wrote the book, but I had the series prepared before I wrote the book. Not all the sermons written out, of course, that would be impossible, but I had a good idea of what Peter was teaching, and I had exegeted most of it, if not all of it, and I knew what parts of Peter I was going to preach on, so yes, it was tied right in with my preaching.
Huh. I would have guessed preach, then write a commentary.
Oh,
but you went the other way around with
it went the other way around, because I had done a lot of work on First Peter. And so when I preached on First Peter in my congregation, then I told them they had to buy that book, and every Sunday they had to read the text I was going to preach on, so that they knew what I said in my commentary. And they did too. Well, I don't think all of them, but most of them did. Yeah.
And did you ever do any chapters of First Peter in your Greek reading class that you recall?
Yes, I think we did, if I recall. Do you recall we did when you were there?
I'm not 100% sure. I think we did chapter 1, maybe 2. I certainly remember end of term test in New Testament exegesis. You set for us 1 Peter 4 verses 1 and 2.
Oh.
I should look it up here. I have a Bible with me. And I remember it being a very difficult text.
Yeah, it is. As far as the meaning is concerned, too.
The meaning, yes.
Yeah, oh, that's what you mean. I thought you meant the Greek.
Well, the Greek wasn't easy, but the meaning of the text was very difficult, about Christ suffering for us in the flesh, being of the same mind, so that we should no longer live the rest of our time in the flesh to the lusts of men.
Yeah.
I found that a very difficult one. I remember handing in the paper knowing fine well I hadn't got it. And
I don't remember that.
when it was marked and handed back to me, I was even sure that I hadn't got it. Yeah. But that's actually very near the subject of this conference, on sanctification. Peter there's condensing and echoing many of the thoughts in Romans 6 and 7.
When I was teaching Greek reading, I would start with an easy book. For example, the Gospel according to John, and then gradually go to something harder, one of Paul's epistles, and then usually end up with some of the more difficult books like Acts or Hebrews, and Peter's writings are among the more difficult books. In fact, I think that, if I remember correctly, Peter's epistle is the only writing in the whole New Testament that has in it conditional sentences that use the optative mood.
Okay, yeah.
Which we hardly even teach because it's so rarely used. I think twice in Peter he uses the optative mood for a conditional sentence. That's interesting.
Well, in writing commentaries, no doubt you refer to earlier commentators. In First Peter, did you find anyone particularly helpful or suggestive for your own work?
I don't like to criticize other writings. I think, well, let me just say this. For the last 25 years of my ministry, I haven't read commentaries for my preaching. I haven't found them helpful. except Calvin. I always read Calvin. I always check up with Calvin. And when I had to get rid of all my books, Calvin's commentaries I kept.
When you moved into your condo?
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so I used some commentaries in my notes, in the notes I had in preparation for preaching on First Peter. And I think I maybe used 3 or 4. And some are better than others, and some better in one place than another place. But I wanted the commentary to be a book for devotions too.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the commentaries are more directed toward scholarship.
Yes.
And I don't mean to belittle scholarship, except that when it becomes an end in itself. But, you know, too, most of God's people aren't scholars and don't want anything scholarly. They want the Word of God that's food that they can eat. And so I wanted to make it devotional. I don't know if I always succeeded, but that was my goal.
Good.
So I did not pay a lot of attention to textual questions or to controversies over the meaning of particular clauses and phrases. I just wanted them to know what God says in this book about your life in the world as a pilgrim.
I think Peter would have appreciated that thought too.
I think so. Peter, the Bible tells us quite a bit about Peter. He didn't care much about scholarship, did he?
You don't get that impression.
No. But he was deeply concerned about the welfare of the people of God. That he was. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Hanko. That's a Pilgrim's Manual, a commentary on First Peter.